Hello, I'm Andres Medagados, and I am tonight's moderator for your presidential town hall. I'd like to, in order, introduce our candidates once more. Let's first introduce Max S. Warner.
Good morning, everybody, or good evening, rather. My bad.
Next up, Lucas Greifzu. And finally, Noah Golden.
Hello, everyone.
So, the rules are the same from the rules are effectively the same from the previous debates. If you watch those, I no need to repeat them. Is that good, or should I reiterate what the rules are?
Might as well.
All right. So each candidate will have 90 seconds to respond to a question. And afterwards, they will have 4 minutes of discussion time on the question. Is that good? And these are questions that come from our viewers at home. Put these questions in for the town hall. So that's something. So let's move on to our first question. And our first question is, what qualifies you gentlemen to speak about the topic of abortion or women's reproductive rights? And I'd like to first ask Max.
Well, thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Before we begin, let me present a timer.
It's a little late for that, buddy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A little late for that, buddy.
I can keep track if you would like.
All right. Well, I thank you then. I guess for the timer.
All right.
I didn't do a speaking order.
All right.
You have the timer now. Oh.
All right. So thank you, Mr. Moderator, for that question. Now, first of all, we live in a country called the United States of America with the right to freedom of speech and opinion. But if that's not good enough for any of our potential voters, that is myself and Hans Salyadar, the fact of the matter is we only want what's best for the women of this country. We're not trying to dictate how, they should run their lives, but we believe that morality also factors into this. We need to remember that morality is also something that this country was founded on, and if something is immoral, we have a duty to speak up about it. Now, I'm not saying that I am pro-abortion or anti-abortion. That's not what I'm trying to mention. The point that I'm simply trying to make is we are qualified because we are also fellow human beings, fellow Americans, not to mention the fact that we are not trying to make it, a point of being disrespectful or anything of the sort. We are simply trying to have civil debate, civil policies, per se. And thank you.
Thank you, Max. I would now like to ask Lucas to speak.
Well, I'd like to start by saying I'm glad that Max has realized that we do, in fact, live in the United States of America. Also, on the topic of the actual question that was asked, we live in a country where issues aren't divided, or at least they shouldn't be, among gender or any sort of other qualifications. We're already divided enough as a country, so we need to truly bring ourselves together and talk about these issues as an entire people instead of whoever we think might apply to them best.
Thank you. And finally, I'd like to ask Noah to speak.
I'd like to start by saying what I said before when we talk about taxes. We live in a society. We all get an opinion on anything, whether it gets taken into account or not. We all get a say, and that is one great thing about America, that we do all get a say. So we need to take that into account. And if we were to use that train of logic that only women get to talk on women's issues, then we would also make the opinion that only gun owners can talk on gun issues and all sorts of things. It just becomes a mess when only a specific group is only allowed to have an opinion on a topic. It's just not how we work here in this country, and it never will be. So let's be Americans here, and let's all hear each other out, because all of us come from different backgrounds and have different opinions and ideas on stuff.
Thank you. So now you will have, if you would like, you have 4 minutes to debate on this topic. Or
I feel like we're all pretty much unanimous on this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think we.
yeah, all right,
any disagree.
good. Let's move on to the next question. So this one is a little bit like near to my heart since I have friends who like have like gone through this and kind of like me to an extent as well. What are your thoughts on allowing minors more options to escape abusive households? Since like currently it's a little bit up in the air because like it's parents could easily lie about them abusing their kids. So how do you plan to tackle that? And I would like to first ask Lucas to speak.
Children in this country are far too. How do I say this? They don't have enough ability to fight for themselves in the country that we live in, and that starts with the right for children to vote. And that's not necessarily what this question is about. But kids in this country need to be able to have the rights and abilities to do what's in their best interest, even if their parents don't necessarily agree with what it is they're doing. And this can be applied to any number of topics, as I mentioned, the right to vote, or as you mentioned with this question, the right to escape abusive households.
Thank you, Lucas. I'd now like to ask Noah to speak.
There are already countries in the world that provide telephone service lines or have governmental services set up for kids specifically to be able to escape households like that. In fact, I actually saw the other day there was a cool I don't know if it's a billboard or whatever it's called. It's like on the city where you see those advertisements pop up. It's set up in such a way so that the top part where an adult was looking at it, it looks like, a kid normally. But from a kid's perspective, the way that the billboard was set up, it showed a kid that looked beat up and said, call us, we'll fight for you. And it's, to get them out of the household. So I think that's something that the United States definitely needs to look more towards because it's an issue everywhere. It's not an issue. It's not an issue in any specific country. It's an issue everywhere and everywhere in the United States that there's kids that are just hoping to get out of the household that they're in. So that's something that I plan in a golden Sikkim presidency. We plan on helping strengthen those government programs to help kids get out of abusive households.
Thank you, Noah. I'd finally like to ask Max to speak.
Well, thank you, Mr. Moderator, for that question again. First of all, I would like to apologize on behalf of all of my fellow Americans to any children who have had to grow up in an abusive household like that. I think, first of all, we need to remember that all children are endowed with inalienable rights, just like all adults are. All children have basic rights to food, housing, what do you call it? Not perfect, but good treatment, not to be abused, etc., etc. And any household in which they reside in that violates that is essentially, in my view, akin to treason, because after all, you are pretty much abusing an American child. The way I see it, we need to strengthen children laws and children protections, and we need to dedicate more and more time of the federal agencies to helping solve these cases. Not to mention, we should make it far easier for minors who are self-sufficient, who have a job, who have contacts, to leave those kinds of households. And I thank you.
Thank you, Max. Would you guys like 4 minutes to speak on this topic? Debate?
I'd like to quickly bring something up, not necessarily in rebuttal to any candidates. I couldn't think. I was struggling to remember what the actual term was when I was talking, but there is already a system in this country that allows minors to emancipate themselves through, I believe it's the court system that they're allowed to do this in. And we need to really improve programs like this, as Noah was talking about, because that's really the only way that minors have right now in the federal government to fight for themselves.
I agree completely. There's just this is something that does have a lot of room for improvement because, like, I see it online all the time. I'm someone who spends a good amount of time, scrolling through TikTok, and it breaks my heart every single time I see someone post something that says, if this gets X amount of views, I'll be able to have enough money to get out of the place that I'm in. And that just breaks my heart all the time, every single time I see it. So, if we can make this easier, then by all means, let's do that.
Yeah, I am agreement with both of you two, but also I think something that a Warner Cellular presidency would build on is that emancipation should not be so damn expensive, and certainly it shouldn't be something that's so dependent on the household that you're trying to leave, and it needs reform.
Exactly, I agree. We need to have a government-funded program similar to like a welfare style program where children are able to take advantage and help emancipate themselves from these households.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about when I said I would help create a service like these other countries have, because it would really help with this. So, yeah, I believe we're all in agreement here then.
Mr.
Fantastic.
Moderator.
Andreas.
Oh, I'm muted. Sorry, I didn't think I was muted. I thought I pressed the button. I'm so sorry.
Noah's gonna have some more fun editing today.
I'm not gonna edit that. I don't care.
Yeah, it's gonna be funny. But speaking about funny, this is kind of a question that I think is really neat, and I think that should be talked about.
It's neat.
Yeah. Should the United States penny remain in circulation? And I would like to first ask Noah to speak on this topic.
Me being a Jew, I do like my pennies. But that aside, there's merit to both arguments because the penny itself, it costs more to make than what it's worth. So it's a difficult call to make. But I think if we're gonna really want to get exact values, as of right now, yes. But down the line, if we really get to automation on this extreme level where money is all online and on card, then we could definitely see where we can go with that. But as of right now, it should stay in circulation.
Thank you very much. I would now like to ask Max to speak.
Well, thank you, Mr. Moderator. Honestly, no, I don't think the US penny should be in circulation anymore, nor should it be produced. First of all, have you ever used a penny? Like, I have a wallet that has a coin slot in it, but I don't like pennies. Honestly, I hate them. I don't use them most of the time. Most people don't. You don't have enough to bring to the bank. Not to mention they've become irrelevant ever since pennies have lost most of their value due to inflation. Plus, the US Mint pays more to mint them than anything else. So, first of all, we should cease production of the penny, start recalling them in mass numbers, and also we should melt them down and use them for something else. At the end of the day, we could save a lot of money on this. And I think that's the point that I'm trying to make here is the monetary issue. And thank you.
Thank you. So I would now like to ask Lucas to speak on this topic.
Yes, I do not believe that the penny should remain in circulation. I don't know. I don't think we should recall it, but some facts for you just off the top of my head here. A vast majority of pennies that are minted in the United States get mailed back to the Treasury anyway. They take them. A lot of people take pennies that they find, and they put them in envelopes and mail them back to the Treasury, which is very financially, for lack of a better term, it's financially stupid. The mint spends millions of dollars minting pennies every year to just essentially have them mailed back to them in the end, and would really just save a lot of money as well as a lot of time from the mint if we were to eliminate the penny. Another fact before I yield the rest of my time here, it's actually illegal to to give pennies into toll booths in every state except for Kentucky.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask my fellow candidates a question here.
Let's hear it.
You may ask the question during the open debate that you guys have now.
Not that I disagree with you guys, though it does, break my heart to hear such things. What will we do with let's just say sales tax. So, if we were to take out the penny, we would be left with only units of 5 and 0. So numbers ending with either 5 or 0. What will we do with tax?
Well, may I respond to this first?
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
it's
thank-
open debate, so you can
Yes.
go
Oh,
however you
okay.
want.
Thank you. Well, first of all, let's remember the Canadian system. What did they do when they abolished their penny? They said for credit cards, it's still going to be charged the exact same amount to the cent as it once was. In cash transactions, it was rounded up to the nearest amount. So let's say you had a transaction of $1.02. Then it was $1.05 if you paid in cash. But if you paid with credit card, you would still pay $1.02. Not to mention, I forgot to mention it, but the fact of the matter is pennies are not accepted at vending machines, at toll booths, and pretty much any kind of automated thing. And
Except for
cashiers
Kentucky.
don't like them either. So,
Can't forget about Kentucky. Kentucky is a very important state.
yes.
Yeah, but I agree with Max. There's really no need to keep the penny in circulation. Like Max said, we can round up when you pay in cash, or round down, whatever is close. Not round down, but round up really when you pay in cash. But it's really just there's no point in having them. Like, then it's not like we're removing them from, like you're saying, you can't use a penny. It's just that we're not going to print them anymore. So there's still going to be pennies lying around. We're just not going to print them anymore, or mint them, whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
All right. So I'd now like to move on to the next question. Let's do this. So this is actually a question to a single candidate. And this question is, Hans and Max, why do you plan on making Social Security private?
This is not
fun,
my
Max.
favorite topic, but to be very clear, I myself do not believe in privatization of Social Security. This was a comment made by my VP in a stressful time. Now, I can understand the point that he's coming from, where maybe he doesn't really want to see more taxes on the lower class through the Social Security tax and the payroll tax and what have you. But I believe that Social Security is a necessary part of our society. If we could decrease that tax somehow, it would be lovely. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people rely on Social Security. In fact, I'm very pro Social Security, and honestly, I myself don't believe in privatizing it. Thank you.
All right. And since that was an individual question, I don't think we'll debate on it. I'd say, or
That's
unless
fair.
you want to debate on it, that is.
I'm all set.
I think we're good here.
It appears as if he's muted himself again.
He
Yes,
has
you
muted
muted
himself.
yourself, Andreas.
Quite the lapse here.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. So we have another question that is to a specific candidate. I just want to get through these as soon as I can. It says, Lucas, your campaign has had people dropping in and out of your VP spot. How do we know that when you're in office that wouldn't be an issue?
I trust Vaughn. Vaughn is a very good individual. Unfortunately, he had to pull out of the race for personal reasons. So I did select Christian, but Christian will remain the vice president if and when I am elected president. Tomorrow, actually, is election day. Christian will remain the vice president unless otherwise instructed to, or unless he personally decides to resign for his own reasons. I had no personal problems with Vaughn. We didn't disagree on anything. He dropped out for reasons personal to himself.
Thank you. So now let's move on to another question. So, number 2, how do you think your ethnic backgrounds influence your policies? And I would like to first ask like to ask Max to speak.
Well, thank you, Mr. Moderator. Certainly, that is an interesting question, but the way I see it is this. As a person of mixed race, not to mention as a person who was born to an immigrant parent, I have to very much favor policies that are more, shall I say, equal and fair to all Americans, not just, the people who were born here and have been here for several generations. The fact of the matter is, we are all Americans, and I believe in unity. I believe in unifying everybody, that all people, regardless of whether you emigrated to America 5 years ago or whether your family did it 300 years ago under the British colonial administration, you are still just as American. And I think my ethnic background influences me in a manner of sort of, because I believe that all Americans should be equal, of course, but also that the people who are minorities, of course, should have past wrongs righted. Now, I'm not implying anything with that. I'm not implying reparations or anything of the sort. I'm simply saying that we need to be equal to each other. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I would now like to ask Lucas to speak on the topic.
Now, I do know what my heritage is, and I am proud of my heritage. However, I don't usually let my heritage control or define who I am. And that's the same way that I would approach the presidency. My heritage is not the only race of people that are in this country. I need to be president for everyone, not just who is closest to me in terms of race. And I believe strongly that my candidacy has not been impacted by my race whatsoever so far throughout the campaign, nor will it impact my presidency if I am elected.
Thank you very much. No, I'd like to ask you to speak now.
So there's a underlying part to this question here, and I'd like to address the difference between policy and way of doing things, right? Policy and style. So my policy would not be affected whatsoever by my heritage, right? That's just not the way that I'm going to roll, and that's just not the way that any president should roll, letting their heritage decide how they are going to deciding what they're going to do as presidents. Just not how the system works. Though it's good to have people of different heritages as a president, because it gives them a different background where they come from, that gives them different mindsets on how they might go about things. So it's different, but it wouldn't affect policy at all. Maybe a way of doing things maybe would be different, but it's just, policy would not be affected at all by it, because that could be dangerous. And, that's one thing that we did have a problem with when we talked about immigration.
Okay, thank you. So now you have 2 minutes to openly debate this, if you would so choose.
Well, I just like to.
Go ahead, Max.
I just wanted to make a very quick clarification on my comments, which was I in no way implied that my own heritage would impact any policy decisions I make. My policy decisions are inherently American and American first. And also my policies are not decided on the basis of race or ethnicity.
I was going to say that I absolutely agree with Noah. While my race, and for that matter, I hope that no one else in my administration's race is going to impact our policy, it is very important to hear every side of the argument. In any real conversation, it's very important to do that so that you can grasp a full picture of what it is that you're deciding on. And I do hope and strive that is something that we will achieve when we are elected president.
All right. Okay. So that was a pretty good discussion. Well, it was kind of short, but it was sweet. So let's go to another question then. So one question from one of our viewers is, what are your thoughts on the Electoral College, and should it be replaced? If so, what should it be replaced with? And I would like to first ask Lucas to speak on this topic.
The Electoral College is an outdated method of counting votes or having your votes counted in this country. I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but if you look at my home state of Connecticut, for example, we have 7 electoral votes and roughly, I believe it's 5 or so million people, 3.5 million people, something like that. I'm not entirely sure. But when you do the math out, each electoral vote represents around 700,000 people, people's individual votes in this country. So you really have to think for a second about the Electoral College and realize that with the large amounts of population that we currently have in this country, which was nothing that the founding fathers were even thinking of back when they first installed it, that it's really an outdated system that needs to be replaced. Now, I am personally in favor of a straight up and down popular vote decision for this country. That is the most democratic option. And while there are things that could potentially go wrong with that, spoiler factor being an example of one of those things, I do believe that is the fairest and most democratic way to vote in this country, because we are, after all, a democracy, and we should truly get back to that.
Thank you, Lucas. I would now like to ask for Noah to speak on this topic.
If you know me, you know that I'm a big fan of the alternate vote and the electoral college system. There's 2 ways that we could go about this. Either we install we install an alternate vote in the electoral college system, so all states adopt, like Maine did, an alternate vote system, which is probably my least favorite option. Aside from staying at a popular vote, or we abolish the electoral college and we go straight up to a alternate vote system, because that would remove the spoiler effect and that would absolutely remove minority rule. Because with a straight on popular vote system, a person that most of the country does not want to be president could be elected president. And that's the same thing that we saw with this election with the electoral college. It could be the same way with third parties in a straight popular vote. So we should be able to allow more people with more ideas to express how they feel and express who they want as their candidate, instead of forcing a 2-party system. An alternate vote would allow that, and in worst case scenario, it would allow us to stop the spoiler effect.
Thank you very much. And finally, I'd like to ask Max to speak on the topic.
Well, first of all, I believe that the Electoral College is one of the most outdated voting systems in the world. We have to remember that most states have a winner-takes-all system, and that's just not right, because certain states vote differently, and if you don't award proportionally, then you're throwing out half of that state's votes. Not to mention the fact in the 1970s, this country adopted the model of one person, one vote. And one person, one vote is directly contrary to the Electoral College. If that's the case, we should operate under a standard popular vote system. But the way that I see it best is a system like under the Weimar Republic, which was 1919 and 1932 in Germany, would be a system of 2 rounds of voting where everybody votes for the candidate or party they'd like, as many parties as you can fit on the ballot, essentially. And whichever candidate wins the most votes wins the election. And also the fact that they would have to form coalitions would probably be a good thing for this country. Thank you.
I would like to respond.
I thought you guys were going to say, like, you guys all in agreement, but you can take this 2 minutes to openly debate now. I'll go silent.
Max, what the system that you just proposed is called the approval voting system, and that will still lead to strategic voting, and a lot of people who and there's a lot of people who would end up settling at some point for a candidate under that system, where they would where they know that there's 2 people who have there's only 2 people who have a reasonable chance to win, so they only put down one candidate even though they can put down as many as they'd like. That's just a method of strategic voting, though I do concede that it is better than a popular vote, because it still gives people to really voice their say in how many candidates there are and who they agree with the most. A straight on popular vote just makes people settle, and that's what we saw these last 2 elections. People were forced to settle And then if not, then they had to worry about a spoiler effect, like what happened with Gary Johnson in 2016.
Well, I'm going to respond to that real quick. I think, first of all, we have to remember that technically, under the current system, there is nothing stopping you from voting for a third party candidate. In fact, if this entire country voted third party, but the Electoral College voted Democratic and Republican, you could change around the entire fabric of this country and cause a constitutional crisis. But the point that I'm trying to make is this country historically has been for a two-party system. It's almost ingrained into American culture, and even if a more democratic system leads to a two-party system, at least it's more democratic and not picked by electors.
I'm going to respond here before time runs out. I'm just going to say a straight up and down popular vote system, yes, well, it does encourage a two-party system. Like Max said, that's how this country is run in a vast majority of its years. And that doesn't necessarily forbid you from voting for a two-party candidate at that point, or a third-party candidate, rather. At that point, it's that third party's responsibility to try and convince more people to vote. And yes, while I understand that third parties might not have the funding, that's not the American people's fault, and that's not necessarily the federal government's fault. They haven't rallied enough support behind their ideas to be able to be heard on the same table as main party candidates.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to go. Okay, that's that. Also, before we move on from this topic, I would like to inform the candidates that there is an act in this country that if you get 5% of the popular vote overall, you get.
Then your party becomes a major party and receives national funding. But the
Yeah.
problem is that we have so much division in this country and so much fear because of negative campaigns being run on both sides due to the plurality system, that it just doesn't allow for a third party candidate to even get to that point. That's why an alternate vote system would allow more freedom to do that.
Yeah. Then let me pose a bonus question.
Hold on
for you.
quickly. I just want to respond to that. Alternate voting system isn't going to change how the results of these elections. Yes, third-party candidates will get more votes and they will probably reach over the 5% marker, but a main party candidate is still going to win the election. That's just how it's going to work.
Okay,
Work out.
then let's think about this long term, right? This would completely get rid of the spoiler effect, and to that, people who did want to vote for that third party candidate, now that that party can actually receive national funding, they can actually make their campaign stronger, and they could get out to more people and receive more voting, and that would very much change how the results come. And in time, it would allow more political parties to get into it, because now we don't need to worry that a party with 40% of the popular vote won. That's just, we're not going to have to worry about that anymore, because now we're going to be able to get candidates in office that the majority of the people in this country, under any circumstances, were okay with.
The majority of the people in this country did vote for a candidate. It's not like
I'm not saying
it's not like 10 people are voting and that's just how it's working out. That's not what's happening in this country.
I'm not.
Majority
That's not
of
what
the
I'm saying
people
either.
did
I'm
vote
saying that
for
people
a
had to
candidate.
settle. That's what I'm saying.
Hey, if I may settle in as ask a few things as the moderator, just like to pose to this discussion. The first thing I wanted to say, is that I, as the moderator, have heard a lot of sentiment saying we're like, they didn't vote for Biden in this election because they liked what he was doing. They actually don't really like Biden. They just didn't vote for him because he wasn't Trump and he's the only other major party candidate. And the second thing I wanted to ask is, this is a question for after you're done debating this topic, but this is a bonus question, by the way. This was not in the polls. But do you think then that the threshold for getting national funding for your party should be lower?
May I respond to that first?
Who's going first?
Max, if you want to respond to that, you can, and then I'll let these two fine gentlemen get back to their discussion.
All right, thank you.
I
Well,
want to
first of
respond
all,
to it too. It's just,
yeah, well,
Understandable.
first of all, Andreas, before I even get to that question, what you just described is settling for a candidate. But going back to the actual question, yes, I do believe that threshold should be lowered at least just a tad bit, because parties cannot survive without at least a tiny bit of money in order to operate. Not to mention, if people don't hear about a party in the first place, how can they even vote for it? And so I conclude.
Who would like to speak on that next?
Me.
No, I know. Okay, no, you can speak on that next.
For me, I think the 5 mark is good to be deemed a major party, but I think that I think the party system is awful in this country because it leads to division. But regardless, if you have an alternate vote, I'd say if you get to the 2.5% mark, then you can receive some funding, not complete major funding, but if you receive 2.5 or even 3%, doesn't necessarily matter, you can receive some national funding. Then once you hit that 5 mark, then you're going to be deemed a major party. This allows parties to grow over time and will lead to a much healthier democracy, and it will lead to the 2 major parties needing to actually put up better candidates instead of saying, all right, we'll put up a candidate and he'll get votes just because he's either red or blue. So
Why don't
that's
we take I'm sorry to interrupt you. Why don't we take that even further and just straight up and down eliminate political parties in this country? And that way we can just have people who want to run for president campaign on their actual beliefs instead of what their party deems as acceptable beliefs for them.
I personally like the idea of getting rid of parties.
Well, I think, first of all, in that case, the founding fathers, yes, they didn't really want us to have political parties, but in any political system, without parties, God, that'd be a complete disaster. Without any parties, if you had to vote based on person, you'd have nobody showing up to those polls because there's no such thing as rallying around one candidate. Half of the Democratic voters only voted Democrat because of the party. Half of them didn't even like Joe Biden. They said, let's settle for Biden. That's the
Exactly,
thing
that's
about settling. Yeah.
That's the point, though, Max, is at that point you're eliminating the party, so those people have no obligation to their party. They can vote for whoever they choose.
Yeah, but then how will they rally around a candidate? It just you'd have so
same way
many
they rally around
candidates
Because
that
they
none
want
of them
that
would
to
win a
actually
do
work
it
majority.
in
now.
policy.
The same
Yeah,
way that they
yeah,
do
but
it now, they're rallying around a policy instead of a party, which is
yeah, but
ultimately
none
what
of
this
them.
country is more about.
But this country being so diverse in numbers of people, none of those candidates would gather a majority. Is the point? Parties can gain
If someone
majorities,
would
but
gather a
not
majority, they wouldn't
people.
gather more than 50%, but that doesn't always
An
happen in
alternate vote would
presidential
help.
elections. If you look, for example, at elections that happened earlier in this country, there were a lot of there were like 5 or 6 political parties that had a major role in every election.
Yeah. So there's so
Candidates
much.
sorry to interrupt, but candidates haven't always
worries.
gathered more than 50% of a vote in this country. That's something that's happened more recently as a
That's why
result
I
of
mentioned.
a lot of the third parties unifying in with the 2 major ones.
It's why I mentioned the system that I proposed, and also coalitions. Coalitions would fix everything, pretty much. Would force parties to cooperate.
People aren't prevented from making coalitions. They just choose not to because they don't necessarily agree with a candidate. But that's the thing with eliminating political parties, is that you don't have any obligation to party, and you're free to obligate and associate rather with anyone that you want to.
Oh. It sounds nice in theory, but in practice, I don't think it can be achieved.
I think that might come down to a problem of of funding more than anything, which is why I think we could go either way with it. Because if we're worried about the fact that funding would take over, which is an actual concern, on Max's part, likely that it would be the person who has the most funding would get the furthest. Then there is merit to keeping parties. I just don't like my biggest problem isn't entirely political parties. My biggest problem is a 2-party system. That's my biggest issue because it just only leads to division in this country.
Thank you. So if you wanted, do you guys yield the rest of your time? Do you want to move on to another question?
Yeah,
I
almost
yield the rest of my time.
All right. Okay. I just wasn't sure. So. Okay. So. The next question I want to ask is, how would you plan to fix K-12 education in this country? And I would first like to ask Noah to speak.
There's countries around the world like Finland that are actually doing spectacular things. Being a student in this, K through 12 system, I'm in 12, and I'm so happy that I'm going to be getting out soon. We look at this, and I think there's a very general agreed on consensus between almost all students that our school system is failing us because we learn so many unnecessary things, and it causes such an unnecessary amount of stress compared to what it's worth. In Finland, they have a system where you're not forced to take classes and learn lessons that wouldn't help you in life based upon on what you're interested in doing. Right now we're forced to take 4 years of English in high school. We're forced to take 4 years of math, 3 years of science, when, a lot of us are not entirely interested in that. In Finland, they have shorter school days and no homework. And they have the best school system in the entire planet, according to almost all metrics. So, there's definitely work to be done in K through 12 to make sure that all students aren't forced into classes that they aren't interested in, because then that's how we begin to fail students.
Thank you, Noah. I would now like Max to speak on this topic.
Well, thank you, Mr. Moderator. Certainly, I believe that K-12 education needs to be drastically improved. First of all, we have to remember that all students are pretty much forced to go through a bunch of classes that they will never think of again. I remember back in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, whenever I finished a course, at the end of the school year, I would take all my papers and throw them right in the recycling. Or after my junior year ended, I shredded 99%, if not 100% of my papers, because first of all, we don't learn things that benefit us later on. It's pretty much all for the diploma in this country. And we have to remember that we should institute a system similar to Germany, where my cousins live. And the thing is, over there, you learn, to benefit yourself in life, not to mention the fact that you get to study what you want. After you finish, you get to either go to a public college or university, or private college or university at low prices or for free, or you can go to a trade school and learn a trade. And the thing is, we need to focus more on the benefit to the individual, and not so for this grand scheme of, oh, let's prepare them for a job in this long process of an economy.
Thank you, Max. And then finally, I would like to ask Lucas to speak on this topic.
Education is probably the biggest part of my platform in running for president. The education system in this country is broken, and it has been for a very long time. We no longer compete with any countries in any education metric whatsoever, not reading, math, science, technology, any sort of country like that. And we need to start from the bottom of this problem and build our schools back up to where they should be. Education is roughly 3% of the federal budget in this country, and we fund 8.5% of total public education in this country. And we need to boost that up so we can give our students a better future. We need to start by ending teacher tenure in this country, so that teachers now have incentives to teach their kids, instead of just working to get tenure and then not caring about our students anymore. We need to start at the absolute bottom with providing free pre-K across this country for everyone who wants it. We need to replace school vouchers in this country, because they don't really help that many people. And we need to, instead of using that money for vouchers, we need to use it to fund public schools even further, to build them up off the ground with things like more technology and more infrastructure. We need to retrain teachers who aren't trained and taught in the topics that they teach, which is a big problem across the country. We need to train them in topics that we lack in more, such as teaching technology and teaching classes similar to that. And most importantly, we need to do what a lot of countries in Europe are actually doing, which is have a 240-day school year with slightly shorter days in the school, regular school day.
Is that all? Okay.
Yes, I'm done, sir.
All right. Thank you. You went a little bit over time there, buddy. Well, just a tiny bit.
You can feel free to cut us off if we're going
I
too
mean,
far
yeah,
over.
but like I was like counting to 5 in my head to like see how much longer it would take. It was like 5-10 seconds over time. It's,
It's
it's
fine.
it's a little bit much,
We
but
have
not
time.
so bad that I'd have to like cut him off.
We have time.
Yeah, we have time. So here's a question that like I think I heard one of you guys answer slightly before in one of your answers, but the question is, what are your thoughts on lowering the voting age to 16 years old? And I'd first like to ask Noah to speak on this topic.
Voting at 16 years old sounds good, but especially when you take into consideration if you pay taxes, you should vote. The problem with that is that their brains aren't fully developed and they're not going to take it too seriously because them not being adults, whatever policies get put into place doesn't affect them that much. So it would sway the vote in a weird way just due to the fact that they don't fully understand and comprehend politics that much. Talking in the wide scheme, I think back to when I was 16 years old and I look at the rest of my grade. I know a handful of kids like myself that were really into politics that could really have good conversation about it and would go into it with an open mind, but the vast majority have their opinions set and social media telling them what to do that it could lead to an unhealthy sway due to them not necessarily um, critically thinking or going into policy, taking it seriously. So I think 18 is a good age. I don't think 16 is a good age for kids to be voting.
Thank you, Noah. I'd now like to ask Lucas to speak on this topic.
Lowering the voting age to 16 or even eliminating it altogether is an idea this country needs to seriously consider, because children in this country are forced to use government services like education, and not necessarily service, but they're forced to breathe the air and drink the water, but they don't have a vote in how to clean the air and water or how to fix education in this country. And as Noah mentioned, they are forced to pay taxes in this country when they want to work, but they don't have a vote of how to improve the tax system in this country. And as the point Noah was making about how children's brains aren't fully developed, the brain isn't actually fully developed until you're 25 years old. So if we're going to use that argument, we need to raise the voting age to 25, which is something that most people in this country, if not everyone, would find absurd. But more importantly, the voting age line in this country is entirely arbitrary. It used to be 21, it was lowered to 18 via a constitutional amendment. So the line is definitely arbitrary, and there's no real means to justify why we shouldn't be lowering the voting age.
I'd like to invoke my right to response since you mentioned me.
Yeah, sure, you may.
In response to that, 18 is the age in which we are deemed adults by our development because we've developed enough to function well enough independently, which is why the age of 18, as I said, is the age where we are deemed adults in the United States. So let's take that into consideration. That's why I think although our brains aren't fully developed at that point, they're developed enough to be able to critically think better, go into policy, be more mature, and not let outside influences like social media get in the way of the way that they vote.
Not to cut Max off from responding here, but there's no the part of the brain that is in charge of critical thinking is the last part of the brain to develop. That's why it takes until 25 for the brain to fully develop. The part of the brain that deals with critical thinking focuses on experiences that you have throughout your life to think about how to improve your life based on decisions that you've already made, which is the part of the brain that last develops. So there's really no metric, like I said, there's no metric based on science for a reason that kids, certainly at the age of 16, if not younger, should be able to vote in this country. As I said, they have to use services, but they can't vote to improve them. And I'll shut up and let Max respond now.
Okay, Max, you may finally speak.
Well, thank you, Mr. Moderator. Well, first of all, I would like to remind the people that this country was founded on the basis of no taxation without representation. What are we doing? We're taxing 16 and 17-year-olds who are working with federal income taxes and other kinds of taxes that any other person would pay. I wouldn't say 16 should be the age, but 17 would be adequate. And the way I see it is this. First of all, the idea that nobody should vote until, first of all, let me invoke history. The voting age used to be 21, it was lowered to 18, and that was perfectly adequate. People were very happy about that because if you're old enough to go to war, frankly, you're old enough to vote. And we need to remember that voting is a standard right of every American. And if you're going to be taxed, you should certainly be able to vote. But let me say this as a response. Lucas mentioned abolishing the voting age altogether. I don't know if that's a serious proposal or not, but to me that sounds just a tad bit absurd. If children can vote, 6-year-olds would be voting for Karl Marx, even though he's dead, but it just doesn't click in my head.
I'm going to respond. No, I'm not seriously planning
you
on
guys
lowering.
have the 2-minute debate time now, so
I'm not seriously planning on abolishing the voting age. I was just using that as an example. The voting age in this country is entirely arbitrary, and it's absurd that you should have to wait until adulthood to vote. And back to more what Noah was saying, adults don't have to prove any level of critical thinking or any level of intelligence or education in order to vote in this country, and we made sure of that with amendments to the Constitution and other laws that were passed in this country. So it's completely, I can't think of the word, but I'll use arbitrary again. It's completely arbitrary because adults don't have to prove any of these measures that we're saying that kids would have to if we lower the voting age.
They're in general already at that level, though, that they have it enough. Let's think back ourselves to where we were as 16-year-olds, or even younger. I don't know what age you're proposing, because you haven't proposed an age yet aside from maybe 16. Let's think back to where we were, and let's think back to where the rest of the people our age were at that time. Most of the people our age didn't necessarily care weren't into it so passionately. The vast majority only get into it when it's an election year, for president. And so that's,
Sorry to interrupt you, but the reason that children don't get into politics is because they have no say in it. They have no reason to get into politics and pay attention to what happens in this country, because until they're 18, they have no means of changing or improving the way that they actually live in this country. And as to an age that I would propose, I'm not going to seriously propose abolishing the voting age in this country, even though there are certainly means by which that it should be abolished, but I would say that probably 14 would be a good age to put, because kids at that age are getting into high school and they're being able to understand these things because they're going to talk about them in history class, and they're going to understand these things so that they can then go and vote, and they're going to certainly pay more attention to it once they're actually allowed to vote.
Kids are very much so influenced by social media at that age. And, a lot of them are also influenced by where their parents are, what their parents are saying.
And adults aren't influenced by social media. You hear all the talk about misinformation across places like Facebook and Twitter, and you're going to seriously tell me that people who aren't influenced by misinformation?
May I make a very brief May I make a very brief statement here, just really brief? I remember at age 14, when I was a freshman, I remember a girl telling me that if she could vote, she would vote for Donald Trump because Hillary Clinton would have brought us back into the Great Depression and she didn't, quote, want to be poor. So 14-year-olds can be a little bit stupid, honestly, frankly. And I think this notion of 14-year-olds voting is madness, if you ask me. 17 would be reasonable, but 14, I can't get behind that.
17 I can see, but I think back to when I was 14 or 16 years old. I certainly didn't have the thought skills. I just took what I said and I didn't think any deeper than cherry-picked information. It's just
you had no reason to. You had no reason to want to look into that information because there was no means by which you could reasonably use it.
That's
If we
not true. I
allowed
was
if
in
we
politics.
allowed children to vote earlier, they would become more experienced with the political system in this country at a younger age.
It's not true. I was into politics back then. I was born into a political family. My mom has ran in every single election since like 2002 or 2003 here in the city of Milford, and she's won every single election. I know how politics work. I've been in it my entire life, but it only took me until this age, 17, when I really fully started to gain those critical thinking skills. We really only begin until we're almost adults to really gain those skills. It's just not how that works. Our development just hasn't gone that far at the age of 14 or 16 even.
Critical thinking doesn't need to be a factor. Adults don't have to prove any sense of critical thinking when they go to vote. So why should children?
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying in general they have enough skills. I'm saying it's the general consensus due to science that they have that much ability to critically think.
There's no means by which to say that a child doesn't, though. Just because a lot of people don't.
I'm not saying a child doesn't, but in general, a child doesn't. In general, like the average child does not.
In general, the average child, and I know I've said this a couple of times, but why should a person live in this country that's founded on freedom have to abide by government laws that they aren't allowed to vote on?
Because they are not old enough to decide who's leading the country.
Lucas, if a child is not old enough to consent to certain things, why in the world should they be able to vote? It's just
so they can vote to lower the age at which they can consent by things. So they can vote to improve education in this country. Or they can vote to improve the tax system in this country that they have to pay taxes into.
They're way too influenced by outside forces at that age. I'm just saying they are way
adults. Adults don't get influenced by Facebook every 10 seconds.
Pardon my French here, but if a kid can't consent to sex, they definitely shouldn't be able to vote. That's just
why it's an arbitrary rule. You're making arbitrary rules that make no sense.
It makes sense. They're not able to do adult acts, so you're saying that they should decide who is in power, who gets the nuclear codes?
They don't get to decide. They don't get to make decisions that adults do because an adult decided that they don't get to do that. So why should children answer this question for me?
Guys, listen. I think you guys are kind of going on repeat now with your points, and I think it's just evolving into senseless, just yelling at each other. So I'm gonna cut that off right there, so it doesn't evolve into an uncivil discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
I left it for too long. I should have cut it off earlier, but I wanted to see where it went before I did anything. Okay, so did I ask you guys this question yet? Do you gentlemen, in the strongest terms, declare American elections free of massive fraud, as Donald J. Trump has claimed?
You have not asked that question yet. No.
Then I would like to ask that question to all of you.
Well, which one of us goes first?
Max, I would like you to go first.
Well, thank you, Mr. Moderator. Certainly, I believe that American elections are free and clear of massive scales of fraud. First of all, we have to recognize that historically, no American election has ever had massive levels of voter fraud, and to think that it suddenly overnight changed because one party is losing is called being a sore loser. And not to mention cherry picking your facts to make it look like cheating or fraud is pretty much also the definition of being a sore loser, and not to mention undermining the foundation of this country. Not to mention, at a certain point, if you start to say that you are going to challenge the election results by force with the army on your side, that is treason. And I think certainly we need to understand that I certainly say in the strongest terms that the American election results are free and fair and devoid of massive levels of fraud.
Thank you, Max. I would now like to ask Noah to speak.
Surely there are some very teensy levels of voter fraud. Massively tiny. Massively tiny. So no, it's not enough to influence election, and I don't know why we're so focused on that. They're just trying to. I think in the Trump campaign, they're just trying to find any foothold to cause chaos on their way out. Because they're sore losers. I hate to say it in such rude terms. Because I'm a big person of respect, but there's just no respect in trying to undermine the confidence in our democracy here.
Right, thank you, Noah. And Lucas, I'd finally like to ask you your opinion.
I want to pick out a phrase that Max used. I find it rather applicable here. Max was talking about cherry picking facts, and in order to cherry pick facts, you have to have some level of facts to begin with. All of the facts that have been reported so far after the initial count and the recount, and then even in some states, another recount on top of that, have all said that Joe Biden has won this election, and there's quite literally zero basis for Donald Trump to claim that there is this mad rash of voting fraud across the country, especially when he didn't, especially when he knew that after he continuously lied over the past 4 years that he was going to have a very hard time regaining office in this country because people stopped trusting him. So to quite simply answer the question, no, there is not a large pandemic of voting fraud in this country.
Thank you, Lucas. And I'm assuming you all agree.
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
So we can move on to the next topic then, correct?
Correct.
Question. Yep. All right. Okay, so now we're getting to some other questions. I'd say let's go for another. We started this at like 4. Let's go until 7:15. I'd say. Is that good for you, lads?
Yeah, we're about an hour into the recording.
Yeah. All right. So next question is: would you increase the minimum wage across the country to $15 or more an hour? And I would first like to ask Lucas to speak on this topic.
Absolutely, yes. The minimum wage in this country is quite just that, a minimum wage. What we need in this country is a living wage. We need a wage, and we need businesses to pay. I'll stop saying wage. We need business to pay their employees an amount by which they can actually live off of and not have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to support them and their families.
Thank you, Lucas. I would now like to ask Max to speak on this topic.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Certainly, I believe that the minimum wage absolutely needs to be raised throughout the country from $7.25 on the federal level to $15 on the federal level, because inflation over time means that $7.25, as it was back then, is roughly equivalent to what $15 is now. And inflation means that the old minimum wage is no longer a wage that you can live off of. Not to mention, I understand that raising the minimum wage can hurt small businesses, which is why I would exempt small, tiny mom and pop shops, but I would certainly apply this minimum wage to places like your local supermarket chain, like Stop and Shop or Amazon, per se.
Thank you, Max. I'd now like to finally ask Noah to speak on this topic.
I know that people are going to disagree with me on this one, but no, I don't think we should raise it to $15. As Max mentioned, that would hurt small businesses, but there's no, I don't think there's quite an easy way to enforce that on, a big business to pay it when a small business doesn't. It makes it a whole much more complicated mess. I think we should cut it at $11 or $12, somewhere around that range, where small businesses aren't forced to pay these large amounts of money for a small amount of employees. And the way that we can make up that gap is by, as I've said before, and as Anish said, putting in a universal basic income so that it makes up that gap without needing to make sure that businesses, so that we're not killing small businesses. This helps businesses be able to pay their employees and not have to worry about cutting employees. Because those employees are getting that money at the same, because their employees are getting that minimum wage.
Thank you, Noah. I almost went on a mute again. But I would now like to say that you have 2 minutes to debate on this topic if you would so choose.
I would just like to quickly say that raising the minimum wage to something that is more livable in this country to $15 an hour is a good example of that. Would actually reduce unemployment in this country because people wouldn't be forced to work 2 or 3 jobs, and that would be able, and then those small businesses would be able to then find more people to fill those jobs, which would in the long term lower unemployment in this country. And a UBI wouldn't necessarily do that. If you take the minimum wage hike, you propose 12, I propose 15, that extra $3 an hour times, let's say, an average of a 40-hour week times 52 weeks a year is much more than a UBI is going to provide in a year, which is something that we need to seriously consider in this country so we can boost up the so they can boost the impoverished out of where they currently are in this country.
That's not the point of what I'm saying. I'm saying that it adds additional money on top of their wage, so that they have enough to actually make a living amount. I'm not saying it's either or at all. This UBI gives them that money to get over that hump, and a UBI puts everyone above the poverty mark, and someone working a minimum wage job actually now has a fairly decent amount of money in their pocket if they have a UBI, because it allows them that extra amount of money, so that they're really making they're making a living wage, but they're also have that extra money to do whatever they want with, to invest in themselves and actually participate in the more complex things in our capitalism, like the stock market, for example, because only the top people in the country participate in that.
Well,
I understand,
know.
but hold on, Max. I understand what you were saying, but you proposed. Correct me if I'm wrong. You proposed a $12 or so minimum wage,
Yeah.
with a UBI on top of that. Am I correct?
Everyone gets a UBI regardless of you have a job.
I'm aware, but you proposed a $12 minimum wage with a UBI on top of it.
11 or 12 would be a good mark.
Sure, whatever. So if you look at the numbers here, adding the extra $3 of income per year gives you more money than a UBI at $1,000 a month would, or $1,000 per, $1,000 per month would.
Yeah, this doubles the amount of money that they have, so that they're no longer struggling to get to. They're not living paycheck to paycheck.
So you would be fine with raising the minimum wage to $15,
No,
and then adding well,
because
that's
that
what
would
I'm saying.
that would hurt small businesses.
Well, that's what I'm saying, though. Is that
May
the
I,
increase of the minimum wage to $15 would add more money than $12 and a UBI would.
Well, if I may butt in real quickly, when I mentioned the Warner Cellular plan, Noah immediately said it would hurt small businesses, which disregarded the fact that I had just said less than 30 seconds before that the Warner Cellular plan exempts small businesses from this huge increase.
No,
Not to
here's-
mention, we should also consider on top of that, it may sound radical, but we should also consider a federal jobs guarantee to ensure that anybody who wants a job can have one, regardless.
I'm gonna avoid the obvious problems with that and just say that there aren't enough markets in this country to guarantee everyone a job.
Not
And
just
I'm-
that, but exempting them would cause us to just put more complexities in the system rather than just putting a flat minimum wage on all businesses, and then that UBI helps carry it over.
The other thing, though, is it's not like the United States as a whole is going to make this drastic jump from, I don't remember what it is, it's like $7.20 or whatever it is, to $15. A lot of the country has already raised the minimum wage to $12 or even $15 in some states like Connecticut.
There's a
So
reason why not many businesses in Connecticut are growing very well too. That's the problem.
Okay, so I assume you guys are done with that then.
Yes, Mr. Moderator, we are finished.
All right. Then let's move on to another question then. How would you prevent Social Security from going bankrupt when the baby boom age group starts to retire? And I would like to first ask Max to speak on that topic.
I understand that myself and my running mate have not had a very good history with Social Security. And certainly I understand that it is about to go bankrupt. And I'll be honest, this is an area where my campaign is not the best of the best. But I will tell you this, we could avoid going bankrupt if we simply increase taxes on the wealthiest 1%. If we just charged federal income taxes to Amazon, to Netflix, to all these different companies that haven't paid any, we would be able to avoid Social Security from going bankrupt. The other thing is we need to really evaluate Social Security and sort of reform it a little bit. I believe that's what Hans meant yesterday when he mentioned wantonly abolishing it. No, that's not. I'm sure that's not what he meant. What I'm sure he meant by that was a reform of the system, which is perfectly fine, where it shouldn't have to dish out tons and tons and tons. And I yield my time.
Thank you. I would like to ask Lucas to speak on this now.
What we need to do in this country is we need to fix Social Security. Social Security is going to go bankrupt in give or take 5 to 10 years once the bulk of the baby boom reaches retirement age. Now, this is something that any real economics professor, any person who studies economics could really see coming, because we had by far the largest baby boom in the world in this country. And then on top of that, we increased benefits for the elderly, which I'm all for. We do need to increase benefits for the elderly so that they can retire at a reasonable age. Now, in order to prevent Social Security from going bankrupt, we need to raise the payroll tax in this country, like Max was talking about. However, we also need to raise the ceiling on which Social Security taxes can be paid. We need to slightly increase the Social Security tax, which isn't going to affect everyone, but we also need, as Max was saying, to implement a much higher tax rate on the wealthy and these large companies like Google and Disney, and you get the gist. There are several more. We need to really do this because a lot of elderly people in this country are going to become impoverished if we don't do this.
Thank you. I would finally like to ask Noah to speak on this topic.
First off, I'd like to say yes, absolutely. These huge companies should definitely pay their fair share in taxes. I think that's generally agreed on to start off with. But one of my ideas, and one thing that a UBI does help, is it takes weight off of Social Security. It makes it so that Social Security doesn't have to pay so much to each individual to really help them. It takes weight off of it. So that's one way that we can really help Social Security with the UBI, because they're getting that flat $1,000 a month plus, maybe a smaller benefit from Social Security, but it's that benefit that keeps Social Security going.
You will now have 2 minutes of I'm going to increase it to 3 minutes. You have 3 minutes of open debate time.
I've noticed that the Golden and Thickenham campaign love to throw a UBI at everything as some sort of end-all be-all that will solve
because it
all
solves 80% of economic problems.
Didn't quite hear that. I'm sorry.
It solves about 80% of economic problems.
In a country that can afford to use a UBI, yes. And while I understand that the net cost of the UBI is only around $300 to $400 billion, we also don't have that extra money to spend right now. We already have to cut corners.
I've mentioned so many times in the ways that we could pay for it. We could help increase taxes, and we could cut military spending. Those are two easy ways, and we could cut a whole ton of welfare systems, and that would easily pay for it. I mentioned there's like 10 welfare systems that I mentioned that if we cut, it would be enough to fund it.
Yes, cutting welfare systems in this country would pay for about 2/3 of a UBI program. We talked about this, I believe, in the first debate that we had. Cutting welfare programs would pay for roughly 2/3 of a UBI, which leaves around $300 to $500 million, somewhere in there. I don't have the exact figures directly in front of me. It leaves somewhere around that, and we can't just cut all of that money from defense. which is the only other program that we have left once we eliminate all of these welfare programs.
With I just see no reason to be spending over $700 billion. So if we cut some of that, at least some of that, it would definitely cover the rest of the cost.
So you're proposing to cut $300 to $500 billion, which is a majority of the defense budget. You're planning on cutting that from defense.
No, I said we cut the funding of the welfare programs, and then we cut military spending like $200 billion, like
which still leaves money that we need to use. We still have money to pay in the UBI. Cutting welfare programs will give you around $800 billion when it really boils down to it. And then on top of that, you need to then cut another $400 to $500 billion.
Wait, what number did you just get when you cut welfare programs?
Cutting welfare programs would give you around $800 billion.
$800 billion, okay.
And a UBI costs around $1.2 to $1.3 trillion to implement to everyone over the age of 18 in this country, which is...
And a gross metric, yeah.
Should I also mention that...
But I'm not saying a gross metric because the net metric doesn't equal out to that.
Have you gentlemen considered giving the UBI only to United States citizens and not every last person in the country?
Yes, United States citizens who opt into it.
To opt in, so it's optional.
Yes. If you don't want a UBI, you don't need to get a UBI.
Give me an example of a person in this country who isn't going to opt in to receiving $1,000 a month.
That's
the billionaires.
I'm not saying that there's people. I literally have the opt-in system for people that don't want it. It makes no difference. I'm not using that as any point to cut the cost of it.
You're underestimating the cost of the UBI.
And you're grossly overestimating it.
Overestimating it. I'm saying that cutting welfare programs will give you $800 billion out of the $1.3 trillion that it costs. Which then leaves $400 to $500 billion that you have to cut from other areas in order to pay for a UBI.
Yes, we can cut some off of Social Security, and then we could cut some off of military spending, and that would cover the rest of it.
Social Security is one of the welfare programs that you're cutting when you use welfare to pay for a UBI.
All right, we're just ending up we're repeating ourselves because we're also not taking into consideration the net cost, which is something that I continuously am trying to repeat. The net cost. And the net cost is far, far less than what you're saying.
Hello, I gave you an extra minute. I was counting in my head, and that extra minute just ran out. So that was the last thought that we're gonna be on for this question. And let's move on to another question.
May I ask, before you go on, how many questions are you going to give us more?
How many questions do we have time for left? Because there's a lot. There's 2 more questions. All right, I'll ask 2 more questions then.
We're going to 6:15. We have time for a few more.
Okay, then 6:15. I didn't know that.
6:15.
That's what we said earlier.
Yeah, we'll go till 6:15 then, and whatever question we end on, we end on. Okay. So the next question I'd like to ask, just for a reminder, did I ask this one yet? How would you plan to fight the current war on drugs?
You did not.
No, you have not.
Yep. All right, then I'd like to ask that question. I would like ask for Noah to speak first.
The war on drugs has been a racist failure since its beginning. The biggest way that we've been trying to fight it is we've been using proactive policing, and we've been putting it in black neighborhoods, which only makes the systemic racism in this country worse. That's something that definitely needs to change, and there's no particular reason for us to be fighting drugs so heavily when it only increases the amount of criminals in this country. When you make more laws and more crimes, then there's going to be more criminals. And why should people be imprisoned for when there's a crime without a victim? So it's just unreasonable. And also, if you look at the specific drugs and their sentences, drugs that are used in black neighborhoods have longer sentences than drugs used by white people the majority of the time. So it's a racist failure, and we should be ending this war on drugs, and that's one of the biggest reasons why we have the most people in prison in the United States.
Thank you, Noah. I would now like to ask for Lucas to speak on this topic.
I agree with Noah on that front. The war on drugs is racist. What he was mentioning earlier about different drugs having different sentences in different communities, that's called mandatory minimums. And yes, mandatory minimums are racist, as the sentencing for cocaine is less than the sentencing for crack. Crack is the drug that is predominantly found in African American communities, which makes it racist. But that's not the only factor on the war on drugs that is concerning. The part that's most concerning to me, at least, is that we're funding both sides of the war. We're funding the side for fighting, and we're also funding the side that is supplying the drugs, because on that point, we're going down into Colombia, and we're obviously committing money to stopping drug trade down there, but we're also funding the prisons that we hold the people in once we arrest them for having drugs. This war has been pointless. We need to start by legalizing recreational marijuana. That's a key part of this thing, is we need to legalize recreational marijuana and release the prisoners from prisons across the country that were arrested for the use of recreational marijuana. We need to tighten down on restrictions for having a lapse here for other drugs such as cocaine and heroin. That way, people will be more concerned with how they use drugs instead of a more lackadaisical approach that goes on in this country with the drug trade, considering that it's still widespread throughout this country.
Thank you, Lucas. And I would finally like to ask Max to speak on this topic.
Thank you. Well, the war on drugs, to be very blunt, has been a colossal failure, to the point where we have literally taken billions of dollars, lit a fire, and dumped it directly into said fire. It is a complete waste of money. Not to mention the fact that we are not thinking about this in the right manner. First of all, I believe we should go the Oregon route and completely decriminalize all drugs. Also, the Portugal route, if you want to call it that. Decriminalize all drugs, focus on treatment for addicts instead of throwing them into prison for long periods of time. And if you really want to stop the illicit sale of drugs, you're going to want to create a nationalized company to produce all these drugs, and arguably even sell them at ridiculous rates with prescriptions. But besides that, the other thing that I wanted to mention is, with a Warner Saludar presidency, on day one, I would order a moratorium on the arrest of anybody for the for a small possession of drugs. We need to realize that people should be treated for this, not thrown into prison for.
Thank you, Max. Would you guys like to openly debate about this? And afterwards, I have a bonus question for you all that was not put in, but I really think is kind of important.
I think we all agree with each other on this.
All right. So my bonus question to all of you is, what are your thoughts on prison reforms? Should prison be abolished? Oh, and another bonus to that question, what are your thoughts on the death penalty? And I would first like
I'm
to
pretty
ask
sure you asked 3 questions there, but
yeah, I understand, but I think it's the entire thing is important. If I were to say one question, just in general, what are your thoughts on prison reforms? And I would first like to ask Lucas.
Prisons in this country are, a lot of people don't necessarily think about it this way, but prisons in this country are broken. They're run down and just quite frankly terrible. And while you might not necessarily think that should be a key priority in the United States, the people in prisons are still United States citizens, and they still do have rights in this country. And if you look in a country like Sweden and Norway, for example, their prisons are very, very advanced, I'll say. They're more advanced, they're better suited to house people, and especially in a country in which we have such a large number of prisoners. In fact, we lead the world in the number of incarcerated citizens per capita. We really need to focus on improving the prisons and making them more livable for the people that live in there.
Thank you, Lucas. I would next like to ask Noah to speak on this topic.
Prison reform is something that desperately needs to happen. One country that I look to in particular that has a good prison system is Denmark. Denmark actually has a maximum year sentence of around 20. I think it's around 22, 23, I believe. You spend 22, 23 years maximum. Now that might sound crazy, but if you look at the actual system itself, it's brilliant because they focus solely on rehabilitation and focusing on the well-being of the prisoners, because they don't look at the crime they committed, they look at the reason why they committed that crime. What situation were they in that made them feel like that was necessary to do? And when they Max, I don't know why you're laughing. If you look at that, it really helps. So if we look at Denmark, they're doing some great things over there, and I think I pretty much gave away my answer. No, I think we should get rid of the death sentence. It's just so ineffective and, to be blunt, dumb, and to be using the death sentence, especially when countries like Denmark have such a great prison system, but don't have the death sentence.
Thank you, Noah. And I'd finally like to ask Max to speak on this.
Well, first of all, of course, there should be prison reform. People are thrown into prison way too often for tiny things, and they're sent to these long sentences, not to mention the burden on American taxpayers. It's just absolutely out of this world, and we should definitely consider reform. And in terms of the death penalty, I know what I'm going to say is completely unpopular, but I am actually very much pro-death penalty. However, I believe that the way we're going about it is wrong. First of all, we need to make sure that those who are convicted to death are guilty of the crime that they're accused of, not to mention the fact that we should obviously those that we are going to execute shouldn't be executed using lethal injection, which is a method that has failed several times over. I would openly advocate for something like hanging or the firing squad. And I know hanging is not very popular anymore, but the fact of the matter is it is more economical, and historically it is quicker and cheaper, not to mention, well, quicker can be subjective depending on how it's done, but the fact of the matter is the death penalty can still work if and only if we administer it correctly.
All right, thank you, Max. So let me just check. Let me just do time check. I think we have enough time for 2 more questions.
I'd like to respond quickly on this matter first.
Oh yeah. I forgot about the open debate. Okay, then we'd have one more time. Then we'd have time for like 1 more question. So this will be the last question that we're going to be taking from the responses, and the next question is going to be quite a special question. So right now, your 3 minutes of open debate starts.
I'm going to quickly respond to what Max said about the death penalty and mention that the reason that hanging as a method of killing people in this country was removed is because it's inhumane. People suffer throughout hanging, and again, while this entire topic might not be a side of things that people might think about frequently, that's still something that we need to concern ourselves with. And I completely agree with Noah that killing people in any fashion whatsoever is wrong, and point blank period. If someone goes to jail for murdering someone, why should we then respond by murdering them? That just is a double standard that shouldn't exist in our country today.
Well, honestly, if you ask me, the whole thing, I only believe the death penalty should be used very sparingly. For example, if you have somebody who went into a school and murdered 34 children, would the adequate response be to condemn them to prison for life? No. And
yes,
honestly,
it absolutely would be, because what's the purpose of killing a person for that. There's
to
no
kill them. Look, it
there's no
historically.
hold on. No. Hold on. There's no point in killing someone because it doesn't provide them a chance to rehabilitate themselves. It doesn't, and again, unpopular side that not a lot of people are going to think about. However, reform, if we're going to talk about prison reform, we need to truly talk about prison reform and not just killing people that commit crimes.
I'm fully on the side of Lucas on this one.
You're not telling me that somebody who murders 34 children should be permitted to try and rehabilitate themselves. That
May I
person
ask you this
should
question?
immediately be shot, quite honestly.
Why
May I
shouldn't
ask
they
this
have a
question?
chance
Do
to
you think they did it?
rehabilitate themselves?
Because
Do
they
you think they did
murdered 34 children.
Do
Christ.
you think they did it purely because they're evil human beings, or do you
They
think that
could
they had?
very well could be.
So
Now
they
that's
did it
hold on.
just because
That's
they're
the
evil.
part.
They didn't do it for any other reason.
If they're mentally ill, that's a different story. But if they did it for fun, obviously we're going to kill them, right?
That's a part of your argument that I don't necessarily agree with. No, is that we can't necessarily look at why people commit the crimes that they commit. We need to eliminating the death penalty is obvious regardless of reasons for committing crimes, but we can't lessen a person's sentence for committing a crime just because they're a nice guy or had different intentions in mind while committing a crime. You can't police people based on what's going on in their head.
No, I'm saying that we should look at the reason why, so that we know how we can rehabilitate them. There's work to be done in knowing how we at least try to rehabilitate these people. I'm not saying we shorten the sentence just because they're a nice guy. I'm saying that we should, take a look at what's going on.
Well, gentlemen, very simply put, the Warner Cellular campaign believes that people who have committed extraordinarily bad crimes should be executed for it.
Extraordinarily bad is an arbitrary term. You can't have it. The main problem with the death penalty is that there's no solid line for it. It's up to
are you telling
me
me
to trying the case.
Are you telling me that Osama bin Laden deserved to be captured and spent time in an American jail for the rest of his life instead of being executed?
Osama bin Laden's a bad example. That's not a domestic issue. That's a foreign issue.
He was somebody who murdered 3,000 Americans.
You can't use terrorism as an example of that, because when we capture foreign terrorists, we also have to take international law into account. We can't solely base our decision on international incidents based on our own laws, because we do not rule the world.
I think that's gonna be our last point for that.
Very well. Yes.
So I would like to end this debate with one final question that I'd like to ask to all candidates. And that question is to say something nice about. Could you say something nice about any of the other candidates here? And I would first like to ask Max to speak on this topic.
Of course, Mr. Moderator. Well, certainly I have nice things to say about both Lucas and Noah. First of all, Lucas, you are very firm and passionate about what you believe in, and you will not back down. You will push for specifics. You will push for facts, even if it seems like the wrong thing to do. You will strive for the best of the best, and that is something I very much respect. Noah, you only want what's best for the country. You care about this country very deeply, not to mention the fact that you are a great compromiser. You see the best in everybody. You see the best in unifying. Honestly, I believe you are a great candidate in and of yourself. And even though I'm running myself, I do wish you the best of luck. And I wish the best of luck to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. I would now like to ask Lucas to speak.
We are a country as a whole, and I believe that's a sentiment that both Noah and Max abide by firmly. They both believe in doing what is best for the country. And now, while everyone on the stage might have different ideas of what that is from time to time, both Noah and Max are firm in their commitment to push for what they believe is best for this country.
Thank you, Lucas. And finally, I'd like to ask Noah to speak.
I'm on stage tonight with two very intelligent candidates. Lucas, you came prepared every single debate with all the facts that you ever needed to mention, and that is absolutely something that I respect. And if I'm elected president, I would have you in my cabinet for sure because you always have the facts ready. And as for you, Max, you also came prepared, and you definitely bring a different side to it. You definitely bring a I would say more of an emotional side to it, knowing, with more of an empathetic look at policy. And that's something that I deeply respect too. And you're both very highly intelligent candidates, and you're both good friends too. So I have no problem with whoever wins this, because whoever wins this, I know that the country will be in good shape. And I know that you guys are built on respect and not, causing more division.
Thank you very much, Noah. Would anyone like to say anything else before I go on to closing remarks?
I'd quickly like to add a fact. Noah mentioned the emotional side of politics, and there's actually a study recently that showed that when people talk about politics, only the emotional side of their brain lights up. The side that is in charge of like critical thinking and in charge of like problem solving stays quiet, which I found rather interesting.
I see.
Weird.
Yep. So, that was our town hall for tonight, and I thank every single candidate for coming out and doing this. And this has been your moderator, and that's the end of our show.
Please go out and vote.
Yes,
Absolutely, vote.
Yes,
vote
please
tomorrow.
vote. Vote
Please
like your
vote.
life depends on it.
I believe
Otherwise,
the
I will
polls are
smack
open
you with the
from,
back of this
9
hand.
a.m. I believe the polls are open tomorrow from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. So please vote during that time.
Oh yeah. Exactly. That's a great point, Lucas.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you everybody for watching.
Yes,
And as I said, vote. See you, everyone.
Yeah.
indeed.
Goodbye.